Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is a good friend of the podcast, Roger Crowley. Roger is one of Britain's best-selling history authors, and I've had him on the show 3 times already. We've talked about the Battle of Lepanto, about the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, and about the fall of Constantinople. And today we're going to talk about the last of the Crusader kingdoms in the Middle East. So welcome back, Roger, to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Russell. It's always a joy to talk to you.
So today we're talking about the end of the Crusader movement, at least the end of the Crusader movement in the Middle East. And as far as I can see, your wider area of interest seems to focus on how Christendom and Islam faced off against each other during what we might loosely call the Middle Ages. And is that a fair summary of your area?
I think it is, yes. I mean, I reach into the early modern period, and I've kind of worked backwards from the Ottomans, versus Byzantium, and interested in, if you like, in the antecedents of that kind of conflict, and particularly the antecedents of what the Ottomans got up to when they entered the terrain of late medieval Europe, which really led me back into the Crusades. And I can see many continuities between Crusader warfare and what followed in the Turkish expansion into Europe.
As far as I can see, a lot of what you're interested in seems to revolve around the Mediterranean Sea. So you haven't done anything about the Turkish campaigns in mainland Europe?
No, I haven't. I guess that my interest is, as you say, very much in terms of the Mediterranean and seaborne exploits and Mediterranean history. I've not dared venture to the gates of Vienna, although people keep inciting me to do it, but I don't read German, so I'm kind of barred from that, I think.
Okay, so your book, The Accursed Tower, is about the attack by the Mamelukes on the last Crusader holdout, which is the city of Acre. And that attack was in 1291. But maybe we should start by going back some 200 years to the start of the Crusader movement, just to sort of orientate ourselves a bit. So can you just say where the Crusader movement came from and just start us off?
The Crusader movement starts at the end of the 11th century. And essentially the core of the Crusader ethos is French. The 11th century is a great era of pilgrimage, and the desire to visit Jerusalem is a kind of strong, it's the ultimate pilgrimage for pious people. The circumstances that surround the beginning of this are really rather mysterious. The Byzantines were under pressure in Asia Minor from the incursion of Islamic peoples, and they did request military assistance from the West. This is taken up by the Pope Urban, who stands up in a field at Clermont near Clermont in 1095, paints this picture of the suffering of Christian people in the Holy Land, a great call to arms. It's a very prearranged event, actually. And this captures the imagination of people, of the desire for salvation, of the desire for pilgrimage. And so we see this extraordinary mass movement of people to recapture Jerusalem. It's an extraordinary tale. I mean, they traipse the 2,000 miles round Europe into Asia Minor. They capture Antioch, and eventually they capture Jerusalem against all possible likelihood, and a massacre of the population. And they establish the Kingdom of Jerusalem. There are really 3 parts to this. There's the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. And we see small baronetcies establishing themselves with great names in these various places. And Jerusalem then becomes a center of pilgrimage. What is apparent to people immediately is that actually the land route is unsustainable. You need to take people in ships. It's the only way, really, of reaching the Holy Land in any reasonable way. And therefore, the ports, Mediterranean ports, Tripoli and the port of Acre, are very, very important to the crusading effort. And these will become a focus of all kinds of cultural conflicts, activities, and settlements in the 200 years in which the crusading project survives in the Holy Land.
And just take a small diversion there, just something you said, the Christians were being treated appallingly. So what is the religious makeup of the people in what we would call the Holy Land at the time? Are they Islamic? Are they Jewish? Are they Christian? What kind of mix is it?
There's a mixture of all the people. And actually, there's no real evidence that they were being particularly maltreated, I think. There were Eastern Christians. This is a multicultural, multi-faith environment, which was kind of getting along, I think, reasonably well. The Islamic world, which is kind of perhaps the bedrock, is fragmented into a whole bunch of little sultanates. There is no unified sense of Islam. It's gathered around Antioch, Damascus, Cairo, each with their own little sultanate. But Christians are tolerated. They are people of the book, as are the Jews. And so it's a melting pot of religions, I think, at that time.
To skip ahead a little bit, by and large, the Christian kingdoms do pretty well, as I understand it, largely because of what you say, that the people who might wish to get rid of them the most, which is the Islamic forces, they're divided. But then along comes, is it Saladin? Is this the man that unites the Islamic forces?
Saladin is the man who unifies the Islamic world with a shared purpose to expel the Christians from the Holy Land. He establishes a dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty. He becomes the Sultan of Egypt, and he captures and takes most of the kingdom of Jerusalem, including Jerusalem itself. And this sparks an attempt by Europe to push back. The critical moment is the Battle of Hattin in 1187, when a crusader force is almost completely wiped out, and the survival of any crusader presence in the Holy Land is now at risk. He takes Acre, very important port, and this sparks a huge counter-reaction within Europe, which turns into the Third Crusade, which brings the King of France and the King of England, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, to the Holy Land to re-establish a presence where Crusader presence is limited to a few very small footholds.
And you made the point, I think, earlier that the only way to get to the Holy Land realistically is to go by ship. And so that means pretty much using the Italian city-states, because they're the ones with the ships. And this is maybe one of the fatal flaws in the crusading movement, is that there's so many divergent interests. And in fact, the Fourth Crusade, which is meant to go out and improve the situation, they divert and they actually attack and, well, they actually take Constantinople, which is a catastrophe for Christendom. And I guess that's sort of one of the signs that the Crusader movement is extremely divided.
Absolutely. They're completely dependent upon the ships of the Italian maritime republics, Genoa, Pisa to a certain extent, and Venice. And these people have a completely different set of interests. They are interested in trade. They're interested in trading with anybody. They're not at all interested in crusading at all. But the Crusaders are dependent upon this maritime lifeline. And the Fourth Crusade was an extraordinary episode in which nominally they're actually meant to head off to Egypt, I think, and end up conquering the Christian city of Constantinople, much of the horror of the papacy. So, I mean, this is just symptomatic of the kind of fractures that there are within Christendom. There is no unified will, and certainly the Italians on whom they are dependent are always going to be a force at odds with the designs of popes and pious Christians to forge a pure Christian presence in the Holy Land. And, it's quite obvious when people turn up in somewhere like Acre, expecting to find this very, very Christian place. They're quite often horrified by what is a multicultural city in which the Italians are trading with the Muslims. There are all sorts of weird Oriental Christians who look like Muslims, who have different doctrinal traditions. And this kind of coming to terms with this sort of cultural melting pot is always a culture shock for the ideas that the Crusaders of the West have when they finally reach the Holy Land. They're in the Middle East, and it ain't as they thought it was going to be.
But you said that when people reach Acre, but I think you said that Saladin had taken Acre. So when did it come back to the Christians, and how did that happen?
Well, Richard the Lionheart and the King of France pitch up with their forces, and there is a massive 2-year siege takes place between 1189 and 1191. Absolutely extraordinary attempt to dislodge the Muslims from Acre. It involves sea battles. It involves bombardment of walls. It takes both sides to the very brink. Eventually, in August 1191, the Muslim garrison surrender, and a deal is done for the exchange of prisoners. But something happens, and we're not quite sure what. Richard thinks that Saladin has reneged on part of the deal. So, not being a man to mess around, he marches the garrison of Acre outside of the walls, 3,000 men, and executes them. And this is going to be remembered 100 years later in the final siege of Acre. This act of treachery by the Christians, this casts a shadow over dealings around this city that will not be forgiven or forgotten.
And you say it was a 2-year siege, and that just seems extraordinary for the time that you could maintain supply lines. And is it on and off, or is it concentrated? How do they manage to keep going for 2 solid years? That seems extraordinary.
It's more or less constant. The Crusaders are resupplied from the West at regular intervals. And obviously both sides have extraordinary problems, disease, defection, double crossing, the whole thing. And it comes down to a slugfest, really. And the walls of Acre, they really take the Crusaders down to the edge. And there's one tower there on which huge numbers of Crusaders are slaughtered, which became known as the Accursed Tower. It becomes the kind of salient point. And there are all kinds of mythological accounts for its name, that Christ cursed this tower when he came to Acre and so on. But nobody's quite pinned it down. Actually, you can find many, quite a common name for towers on city walls in medieval cities. You get, the Tower of Blood, and actually you can come across other accursed towers. There's something about, this obstacle to capturing the city that haunted the Crusaders, and they gave this tower the name, the Accursed Tower.
And so they take Acre, and I think you said somewhere in your book that Jerusalem pretty much is within their grasp, but they lose their nerve, perhaps understandably, after some of the reverses that they suffered. I think you mentioned Hattin. So they don't go on to Jerusalem, but somebody has the idea that if you can just take out Egypt, then Jerusalem will be a much easier city to take.
Richard the Lionheart, who was a fairly acute man, said keys of Jerusalem are in Cairo. And really, this is because this is where the economic and military firepower of Saladin was. He was Sultan of Egypt. And really, if you could destroy or incapacitate the logistical and financial hub of Islamic warfare, Egypt, then the rest of the Holy Land will go down like a pack of cards. And this has strategic implications for what the Crusaders try to do in the follow-up to the Third Crusade. In the 13th century, there are 2 attempts to capture Cairo. This is a weird one because actually you have to quite often lie to your Crusaders that they're going to Jerusalem when actually you're leading them to Cairo, and the incentive to go to Cairo so you could go and take Jerusalem is not quite so great. So very often the objective of these expeditions is hidden from the general public, if you like to say.
But as I recall, certainly the Seventh Crusade was a well-organized affair, and I think the one before that, where they're trying to capture, when they're trying to take out Egypt, these are quite well-organized affairs. But if we just talk about the Seventh Crusade, that seemed to be really well put together and come pretty close to succeeding, and yet it ends in disaster, no?
Yes, I mean it was very well funded. Louis the Ninth, King of France, led it in person as a religious mission, and it had knowledge from an earlier attempt, the Fifth Crusade, which failed, about the conditions which they would confront. The problem was that although they knew quite a lot, they didn't know enough about the Nile Delta, the way that it floods throughout the seasons, the way that you need to manage various waterways, and they get bogged down on the way. They do pretty well, but they get bogged down on the way to Cairo. And the defense of Cairo, I mean, there was a strong feeling in Cairo that the city was going to fall. There was terrible fear. The Crusaders were doing very well, but they get stuck halfway down, cut off from the advance by a tributary of the Nile, which is really quite difficult to cross. And they're confronted by the Sultan's crack troops. And the Sultan's crack troops are a slave army known as the Mamluks, the owned ones. He has a private army of conscriptive Turkic slave warriors. And this is actually a very deep tradition within the Islamic world. It's really a fear of rivals within your own tribe that leads you to recruit these people who are loyal and only owe their existence to you, the Sultan. And it was said that, that one obedient slave is better than 300 sons. So,
and where do these Mamelukes, where do they come from?
They come from the northern shores of the Black Sea. They are people from Central Asia who have been pushed west, really, by the waves of migratory nomadic tribesmen by the Mongols. They are captured on the shores of the Black Sea, sold to Genoese or Venetian merchants who have settlements at Kaffa and one or two points on the north of the Black Sea, but also probably by Islamic traders as well, taken across the Black Sea, sold and sold again, and usually captured as quite young boys. And their skills at warfare were the skills of the Turkic peoples had always been recognized. One Islamic historian said at the time that they are to warfare what the Greeks are to philosophy. These are kids who are starting to wield bows at the age of 4. Tiny bows, and they're extraordinarily skilled tribal people. They're shamanists, and they're converted to Islam. they actually still retain quite a number of their shamanic practices, divination using sheep's bones and so on. So they're kind of alien, and although obviously their corps officers spoke some Arabic, the language of command of these troops, which were probably about 2,000 that the Sultan Turan Shah had, was Turkish. They're alien people. They're outsiders to the Islamic world, but they fight the Crusaders to a standstill on the way to Cairo.
But there was a problem there, wasn't there? Because the Crusaders, they actually surprised the Mamluk camp and overrun it, which was in direct defiance of Louis's orders. And then they go on to attack the city, again in direct defiance of Louis's orders. And that's when they're cut to pieces.
Yes, I mean, it's the lack of discipline of Crusader armies, really. Some noblemen will decide that it's time for a heroic charge. You know, the tradition of chivalry is very often the undoing of these Crusader armies. They're not very well organized to fight in formation. And you're right, they're led on into the heart of a town and surrounded and massacred. And then there's a ghastly retreat up the Nile, being attacked on both sides, men dying of scurvy. And eventually Louis is captured. The king is ignominiously captured. He's suffering from dysentery and had to have a hole cut in his trousers for sanitary purposes, which is not a great humiliating end to this. Thousands of them are killed, and a lot more are taken prisoner and are either ransomed or killed. It's a disaster. But at this moment, the slaves become the masters. The Sultan Turan Shah is killed, and the commanders of the Mamluk force are now actually in control of Egypt, and they bring the heart of Turan Shah to show to Louis as we bring this as a gift, really. So there is a coup out of this expedition. You know, the law of unintended consequences is that we get an extraordinary coup where the slaves become the masters. They're not terribly popular with the Islamic world. These people don't really speak Arabic very well. They're Turkic speakers, and it's a bit of a weird moment, actually, certainly within Egypt.
But this is a formidable force is now taken over in Egypt compared to what was there before, perhaps.
It is, actually. And these are first-generation converts to Sunni Islam, and they bring the fervor, perhaps, of the convert to the Islamic world. You know, there was a lot of deal-making going on. You know, I mean, Turan Shah had said, you know, you can give them, or one of his predecessors said, if it really comes down to it, we'll give the Crusaders Jerusalem just as long as they keep out of Egypt. You know, there's no that kind of unification of Islam for a project which Saladin had held together for a short while had then collapsed, and it's the Mamluks who are going to, as first generation converts to Islam, with the purity of a new religion, who are going to kind of try and unify the Islamic world again to throw out these unwanted intruders from Europe.
And yet, in a way, the unwanted intruders from Egypt, they're small fry compared to what's coming over the horizon, by which I mean the Mongols.
The Mongols are moving west, and in 1258, they deliver a shattering blow to the Islamic world with the capture of and sacking of Baghdad, the great religious, cultural, and scholastic center of the Islamic world. And they kill the last caliph. They roll him up in a blanket and trample him to death. And it is said that they rip the covers, the vast libraries of Baghdad. It's an extraordinary story. Ripped off to make shoes for the Mongols, and they throw the books into the Euphrates, and the river runs black with the ink, and they then advance over the Euphrates.
But hang on, I want to stop you there, because that's one of the most horrific things as an historian or as somebody interested in history that I think I've ever heard, because the Library of Alexandria, we all talk about that. But we were never going to get anything out of the Library of Alexandria because time was going to eat everything. And just, after 1,000 years, everything just disintegrates. But I wonder what we lost from the Library of Baghdad, which could completely conceivably have come down to us.
A huge amount of science, I think, although a lot of this does leach out and will make its way effectively into Islamic Spain, by which it will, through the back door, enter Europe. But we don't know. I think this is an extraordinary city that vanished. It's impossible to know, but a vast amount of stuff. I mean, they were inheritors also, I think, of a great deal of Greek philosophy and science and knowledge, which has vanished.
Yeah, I seem to remember a quote. I can't remember where I heard the quote, but it was something to the effect that whatever the Mongols didn't understand, they destroyed, and then ... they understood very little. And
well, yes, that's a good one. I think that's probably true. In the wake of that, they cross the Euphrates, they sack Antioch, Damascus surrenders, and then they send a calling card.
And Antioch, is Antioch at that stage a Christian city or is it a Muslim city?
It is a Christian city, yeah. They then sent a calling card to the newly, only just established Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo, saying, we're coming for you. We will kill your children and your old men. We will crush you to dust. It is best to surrender now. The Mamluks surrendered by decapitating and quartering the unfortunate messengers of this message, and decide that
it can't have been a very nice job being an ambassador in these times, because you're always hearing about how sacred the body of ambassadors are. But I was just doing something about the wars between the Persians and the Romans, and the number of times the ambassadors are either imprisoned or executed. They didn't always play by the rules, did they?
No, and I suspect that being the bearer of bad news for the people that you're giving to, kind of doesn't help. But the Mamluks, who have really only just got control of Egypt, and they're outsiders and they're not popular, they decide, they know what's happened to Baghdad. There's no point in hunkering down behind probably the not very efficient walls of Cairo. And so they decide they're going to take the fight back to the Mongols. And they get lucky because at that point, the Khan of the Mongols, they probably got something over like 100,000 horsemen in Syria and, in Palestine and so on.
This is the Mongols have got about 100,000.
Yeah. They withdraw most of their men over the Euphrates. And there are two explanations for this. One was the sheer weakness of the Mongol dynasty was that every time that the Khan of Khan dies in Central Asia, all the other leading Khans have to gallop back the 2,000, 3,000 miles to take part in the election process. The other one was that simply that the Mongols are operating at the operational limit once they enter the Middle East, because the grassland of Syria is not rich enough to support the vast number of horses that they have, so that they actually had to withdraw their troops back over the Euphrates to slightly more fertile land. They just leave a holding force of about 14,000 men behind. And it's this holding force that the Mamluk Sultan sets out to confront a man called Qutuz, and a combination of Mamluks, some rather reluctant other Islamic troops. And they meet at a place called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, very well named. These are two people with the same tactics, mobile horse warfare, outflank your enemy and take them from behind and so on. But the Mamluks win it and manage to kill the leader of the Mongol force. And this gives them massive legitimacy within the Islamic world. They possibly saved Islam from complete collapse.
Yeah.
What would have happened if Mongols had taken Cairo? This would have fragmented the Islamic world.
Because at this time, the Mongols are not Muslim, are they?
They're not. But interestingly, what was happening that they tended to settle down, and become more sedentary. And one of the Khans of the Golden Horde, Burkir Khan, I think he was called, converts to Islam, and the Mamluks are able to kind of do deals with him a little bit further on down the road to kind of weaken any kind of, the Khan who destroyed Baghdad and his principality and people. The Mamluks managed to do a deal with the convert Khan to Islam, so it becomes more mixed in time.
So the Mamluks they've gone from being unpopular, maybe they're still not super popular, but nonetheless their legitimacy, their authority and their prestige is now super high, right?
It is. It has to be said that Mamluk command structures are completely dysfunctional in the sense that there are micro-tribes within the Mamluk dynasty. And on the way back to Cairo to celebrate his victory, Qutuz is murdered by another Mamluk called Baibars. And in point of fact, if you do the math, the average life of a Mamluk Sultan over 300 years is about 4 years. It's not a good job.
It's not late Roman Empire.
CEO of Mamluk, not a thing you want to be. And Baibars then becomes the Sultan of Egypt.
But that's terrible news for the Crusaders, right? Because
they don't know it's bad news for the Crusaders yet. And actually, when Baibars gets back to Cairo, he's met with horror by the local population, and they pelt him with offal, which is something that people used to do. They did it to the Crusaders a bit, actually, as well. Crusaders who didn't like other Crusaders pelted them with offal because they saw them as outsiders, potentially unruly. But Baibars is a remarkable man in terms of he is the Saladin of his time. First generation Muslim, single-minded, concerned to forge a unified Muslim empire from the off. Orthodox Sunni, he wins hearts and minds by building or rebuilding mosques, lowering taxes, providing food for the poor. He reestablishes a kind of puppet caliphate who is actually under his control. So, and
sorry, can you just explain what you mean by caliphate?
Well, the caliphate is the leader of the Islamic world, and effectively they all, in various formulations, they are descendants of the Prophet, sort of meant to be direct descendants of the Prophet. But the last of that line has been killed in Baghdad
by the Mongols.
By the Mongols in 1258. So he establishes a new caliphate, I think, with some relative of the last caliph who was killed. But this is and with all the rituals, the anointing rituals with the swords and religious ceremonies and so on. But this man is really a puppet under Mamluk control, and he then sets about. He involves himself in intense propaganda exercise, really establishing his own credentials. He is the Lion of Egypt, and he would badge buildings, bridges with the image of the lion with the raised paw, and very often under the raised paw is a rat. The lion of Baibars is going to splat the rat of the enemies of Islam, be they Mongol or be they Christian. He is intolerant of deviations of standard Sunni practice, hangs people for drinking wine, builds up the Mamluk army with an increased number of slaves from northern shores of the Black Sea. And
these slaves are sold to them, of course, by the Christian.
Quite often by Christians, yeah. The Venetians and the Genoese sell you troops. And he then sets about. Islam is in crisis, really, absolute crisis as a result of the Mongol thing. He sets about really taking control, dismantling a whole range of little sultanates. Some of the Ayyubid princelings have to be taken down one way or another. The princeling Sultan of Damascus or whatever, either suborned or killed. And he starts to build up a very formidable army, which is going to really tackle the problem. He's very intelligent. He burns the grasslands of northern Syria to dissuade the Mongols from making large-scale incursions, although they do make some. He builds up a large, well-trained army, and this army is really not just... traditionally, the Mamluks are mobile horsemen, but he develops or acquires the skills of siege warfare. I mean, actually, there are quite a lot of manuals of siege warfare written within the Islamic world. The military science is quite well developed, and he uses this bedrock of knowledge to tackle what is going to be his root problem with the Christian principalities, which is that they are fortified encampments, effectively. Baibars is a man who never sleeps. He spends, in his 17 years of ruler, he's said to have traveled 70,000 miles on horseback.
Some sort of Charlemagne character.
Yeah. He has 38 campaigns, 21 against the Christians. He's a master of the psychology of warfare. He never divulges the objective of a campaign. He attempts to divide and rule in various ways. He will do a deal with one little, because the Christian kingdoms are kind of fragmented themselves. So he might do a deal with the baron of the county of Tripoli, and he starts to pick off one by one what you might call them, the Maginot Line of forts, the Maginot Line of scattered along the hills and the coast, ringing the enclaves of the Christian presence. Maginot Line implies something which is coherent. It wasn't really, because really some of these forts were held by the military orders like the Templars or the Hospitallers or the Teutonic Knights. Some were held by the Count of Tripoli, and they were kind of individual efforts. But he brings together not only skills of mobile warfare, but the logistical skills required for siege warfare. And this is very important, because really, if you want to take a city, you need to bring miners, you need to bring catapults, you need to bring provisions for a siege together. And so the back office management of siege warfare is very important. And the Mamluks became very, very good at that. You know, it's not just the fighting, it's all the bean counting you have to do, all the organization of supplies. And between 1265 and 1271, he more or less dismantles most of the Christian line of fortifications around the coast and inland.
He even takes crack to Chevalier, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
You would think it would be impossible to look at it.
He does. He was unusual in that he would also campaign in winter. He really forced men hard. But he'd isolated Crac des Chevaliers. He had many strategies, but one account of this is that, you know, they were dug in. When you think of a fort, I mean, the number of men that the Hospitallers or the Templars had in a fort would be very small. It would be a matter of hundreds, but they would be incredibly well defended. One account of this is that he managed to forge a letter from the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, who was elsewhere, saying, "We're not sending you, we are unable to send you reinforcements, so, you know, have our permission to surrender." And which they did. I mean, they'd got within the outer wall, but it was still going to be an incredibly tough fight to get their way in. But the Hospitallers realized that actually there was no way that they were going to survive this. And so they surrendered this fort intact. A lot of forts they destroyed because they didn't want them to be reused by Crusaders. But this one they held on to because of its incredible strategic value. It actually controls a valley called the Homs Gap.
But while this is going on, the Crusaders, I mean, they may be disunited, they may not always be the greatest strategic thinkers, but they know that Acre is the jewel in the crown. And is the English king involved in trying to refortify it or to put it in good shape?
Yes. There'll be slow, sort of small expeditions at regular intervals. People would get a band together, sort of like military tourism, really, I suppose you could say. And Edward, the son of Henry II, I believe.
Is that Edward who's ultimately Edward the First?
Edward the First, yeah. He comes. He's actually got some blood on his hands as a result of what was called the massacre of Evesham, where in the baronial fight with Simon de Montfort, usually when one side surrenders, it's because they're all
related.
They're all clubmen from the Athenaeum. Whatever it was. But they didn't do that. They massacred a lot of knights. And actually, Edward's men, as Prince Edward, went into this fight with Crusader crosses on their backs. It was an interesting one. So he comes over and he's really quite horrified by what he sees. He expects to see this kind of fervent crusading place. And what does he find? He finds Venetian ships in the harbour on their way to Alexandria with wood and metal for the Mamluk war effort, and the whole place, a bit of a basket case. Islamic merchants turning up to do business. In fact, there was a time, I think, I don't know if there was then, but earlier, when there was actually a mosque for the convenience of the visiting merchants in Acre. And you get Venetian merchants traveling to Damascus. Marco Polo actually set off with his uncle and father from Acre, and the Acre was also minting gold coins that were in imitation of the Islamic coinage of Damascus, just for reasons of trade. Pope got very upset about this and told them they had to stop. And so they put some crosses on their gold dinars and went on minting them, and they were perfectly good currency because as long as the weight was okay. So Edward is rather horrified by what he sees, and he conducts some chevauchés, sort of small expeditions, but he can't really do anything. And the fear of the Mamluks and Baibars is a major expedition from the west. This is the one thing you have to prevent and watch your back very closely. He was very worried by the arrival of Edward, and he manages to insert an Islamic renegade as such who wanted to come over to the Christian side into the city, gain the confidence of Edward, and attempt to assassinate him, which he nearly does, actually. He had many attempts. He had many different strategies for solving problems. He was a very flexible, extremely intelligent guy. But in the end, Edward goes home, and it was said at the time, not by him, but it was a saying that the Christian presence was a whelp barking at a mastiff, a puppy barking at a huge dog, that it was kind of hopeless, really. So
you say it's hopeless, and yet Acre, it has fantastic walls, and it has well-designed towers and bastions and gates, and it is a big city. This is not some trivial place to capture, is it?
No, it isn't. No, it's a big city. It's got a population of about 40,000. It's got a population who have been, and this is one of the things that freaked out the Crusaders, really, was that an awful lot of the Christians who had gone there, settled down, spoke Arabic, probably wore Islamic dress, ate Islamic food, went to bathhouses. These are the settled population of people who didn't know Europe, although they were Christians and probably Latin speakers or French speakers. But yeah, this is a well-defended city which can't be surrounded because it's on the coast, with a good harbour from which it can be resupplied, and a formidable obstacle.
But Baibars never besieges it, does he? Because time catches up with him.
No, he doesn't. He has a few feints at it. He'd suddenly turn up with an army and frighten people. And in point of fact, he'd had a good look round it when Kutuz's army had gone to Ain Jalut, they'd nervously been allowed to travel through the territory of Acre and been welcomed inside. And he had actually had a good look at it to see, how it all worked. But he doesn't get round to death catches up with him before that happens. One of his final things was to capture Antioch in a day, which it had taken the Christians something like, when they first captured it, months and months to capture and massacred a lot of people. But he dies, and he's followed up by successors who are also quite efficient. Kutuz is in the next one. But really, by that stage, there are really only a couple of fingerholds left. One is Tripoli, and the other is Acre, and these are critical. The big mistake that Saladin had made was not wiping out the forts, really. The ports. If you remove the footholds, it's game over, really. If you can't land, you can't do anything.
So it's a bit like getting rid of Calais if you're French.
Absolutely, yeah. You don't want to let those English people cross the channel.
So who does decide to take Acre?
It's a descendant called Qalawun, who is the Sultan, again a fervent Muslim, and he finally they decide that they need the two remaining places are Tripoli, which has got a port a bit further up the coast, and Acre. In 1289, he takes Tripoli. There is now alarm within Europe, and the Pope is trying to get a new crusade going. The appetite for crusading is dying, effectively. The French and the English are hunkering down for what's going to be, a conflict.
Oh, I see. This is the time of the 100 Years' Wars kicking off.
Yeah. You really, to get a good crusade going, you need to have a king. Louis IX, Richard, the King of France at that time. But increasingly, it's bad news to leave home. The French and the English are watching each other very closely. In the absence of Richard, John, sort of gets control. So national interests are now superseding religious Christendom's interests. And the only group of people that the Pope manages to get a force together of are really sort of chancellors and the rabble of northern Italy who think there might be something in it. And this force turns up in Acre in about 1290. And the problem for Qalawun is that they've got a non-aggression treaty, one of those treaties, and they take treaties very seriously, actually, on the whole, although Bibles always used to find a clause that, hadn't been covered, and then he would do it anyway.
Let's talk about that. So can you give me any background on why the Muslims take treaties so seriously? Is this because they're sworn with oaths to God and they take their oaths to God seriously? Yes,
they're religious backed, on the word of God. Unfortunately for Acre, these people who turn up, who are mainly poor, and they've got nothing to do, really, and
they can't afford to visit the brothels.
They probably could afford to visit the brothels just about, because that was one of the major attractions of Acre, I think. It was a port town. But there are the two stories. One is they decide to go out on a raid and massacre some hapless Muslim peasants. The other is that they can't really distinguish, between Oriental Christians and Muslims, and they massacre some Muslims for no good reason. Another is that they massacre some merchants who are coming to sell slaves, because it's a slaving center as well, because they want them slaved. One way or another, the massacre of Muslims, the relatives of some of these massacred Muslims make their way to Cairo with the blood-stained clothes.
Oh dear.
And these are paraded in the mosque, and these inflame and provide a pretext for a new campaign. There's a long debate about whether the treaty has been broken or not, but they decide that it has been, and thus we start to see, backed by the fervor of an outrage of this act of these ill-disciplined people who've pitched up. We see Calawan gets together a large army to finally knock out the last, hit the last snake on the head.
And you say that the Christians, they're starting to get worried, and the Pope is sent over this far from helpful force. But as I recall, at the time, people were very critical of the Pope because they felt he could have done more, but he seemed to be more interested in fighting some pointless war in Sicily or something.
Yes, I think that is the case, really, that the papacy had disputes in Sicily. I'm afraid the details of which elude me at the moment. But also there were other places where you could go on crusade now. You didn't need to go to the Holy Land. You could crusade in Spain. You could crusade against the Cathars. You could crusade, the Teutonic Knights could crusade in Lithuania, against heathens. So there were many other ways of fulfilling your crusader vows without going to the Holy Land. So really, although there was concern, there was no unified response. I mean, the timescales to get a crusade together are quite long. Calawan in 1290, end of 1290, is preparing all the logistical support for this. And, there isn't time for a force probably to be put together from Europe. The only likely source of support would be Cyprus, where actually King Henry, the King of Jerusalem, was in Cyprus and was a possibility. Calawan, with all the skills of logistical Mamluk warfare, had been cutting down trees in the Lebanon to make enormous catapults, having these dragged through the winter to Damascus, which was kind of like the arms hub and gathering point for the campaign. Calawan is all set to go, and he dies. And this is potentially a moment of crisis in the Mamluk succession, but his son Khalil really manages to grab the throne ahead of any other rival candidate, and the campaign proceeds. So they're slowly gathering a large army. The size of Islamic armies is always apocryphal. It's always 400,000 as seen from the walls of a Christian city, but probably was perhaps about 80,000. Numbers very difficult to count because they also had masses of support, people who are non-combatants, horses, camels, wagons and stuff. And this slowly moves up the coast and surrounds the city in the spring of sort of April 1291.
Reading your book, the sense I got was that obviously you need enough men to take the city, but the key issue is getting through or over the walls somehow. And the two weapons they have is the catapults and the mining. So do you want to say a bit about their technology there?
Islamic siege warfare was almost a science, I think, by that stage. The first thing is that Islamic sieges always went for the quick knockout blow. They didn't besiege cities for long periods by attrition. 4 or 5 weeks was the max, because they realized that there was a great spirit of jihad behind this operation. Calls to arms in the mosques of Damascus, and so you got a fervor of men who would come to the cause, but they wouldn't see it for a very long time. But you're right; the two weapons of siege warfare are undermining walls and bombarding them. This was an apex, really, of catapult technology. I think the siege of Acre, they managed to bring about 90 catapults to the walls of Acre. This is extraordinary. Logistical and engineering feat. You've not only got to bring the catapults and the timber, you've got to bring the stone balls to the walls. They were very smart. They knew that the rock around Acre was a rather soft sandstone, and so the cannonballs were mined probably about 20 miles away and brought to the walls. Masons had to shape them and all this kind of stuff. At the same time, they bring a large corps of miners, probably about 1,000 miners, skilled miners from, I think, Aleppo. And really the procedure is this. You surround the city which is kind of like a mile from sea to sea. They can't attack it, obviously, from the sea. You dig trenches, first of all, to protect your encampment, behind which you put your catapults out of reach of the enemy. You then start to bombard the walls. They have some very big catapults with names like the Invincible and the Ferocious and so on. When you see the kind of Netflix versions of this, these things smash into walls and destroy them. I mean, actually, their ability to do this was not nearly as great as we see it in Hollywood dramas. But they also had anti-personnel catapults, which could fast firing and fire small projectiles, and these were aimed to really keep the defenders ducking down behind the wall so they couldn't reply. You would then move your front line up under this hail of fire, build another line of wooden barricades to protect your men. You would then move up again until you got within a distance where your miners, hidden behind these screens, could start digging tunnels under the walls, with the aim of tunnels would be just wide enough for 2 men to work in. Again, very sophisticated. They had men who dug, men who removed the earth, men who propped the tunnels, and men who were specialists in when you created a room, a kind of underground room under a tower, who prepared a fire which would hopefully be hot enough to bring down the rocks above and collapse the tower. So they advanced bit by bit by bit.
And were the Christians able to countermine?
The Christians did countermine. You need a lot of men. And really, although they had a mining squad, it was no longer, not just simply not large enough really to meet the needs of the situation, where, they could snake, a dozen mines under the walls. So, and also you need a lot of material. You need a lot of wood to prop as you go along. So they did manage to bring down mines, and it was kind of nightmarish fighting in the dark under the walls. But they were just being overwhelmed by the ability of the sheer manpower that the Mamluks could provide. The other attempt early on was the raid that the knights, particularly on horseback, mounted several nocturnal raids on the camp to try and destroy the catapults. And the Pisans actually constructed a catapult on a ship, which they sailed around the walls and bombarded the camp with. Unfortunately, the sea got up and shattered the catapult. But there was some indication that there was a kind of fifth column within the city. There were Muslim slaves in the city who were perhaps able to fire messages on bows across the walls, and there was a kind of some of these raids were forewarned, and the loss of men, given that there were probably only about 800 mounted knights in the whole of the city. There was about 13,000 infantry. The raids were not successful enough to justify the loss of manpower, and so fairly quickly they kept the gates closed and just hunkered down and did their best.
And if I was a citizen of Acre, I think at this stage I would be heading off to Cyprus to find somewhere that I could sit out the siege and see how it turns out. And yet, on the whole, people didn't leave during the siege?
They didn't leave during the siege, partially because there weren't very many ships there, actually, firstly. And secondly, because the weather was very bad and it was quite rough. And therefore, it wasn't easy to depart. So it appeared that people stayed, mainly because they had to, because there wasn't any. And there was a relief force from Cyprus under the King of Cyprus, but it wasn't really large enough to make a difference to this. So, the walls are slowly being degraded, and the sheer ingenuity of Mamluk siege warfare, they eventually bring down a tower. There are two sets of walls, inner and outer, with ditches between them. Unfortunately, we've got very little idea of what these look like because they've all been destroyed. But the Cursed Tower was a feature of the Third Crusade sieges, was on an inner wall, And one night they managed to bring down the tower on the outer wall, and it was a strewn heap of rubble. And what they did was they got overnight they got a very large number of nose bags, things you feed animals with, sort of hessian sacks, filled them up with sand. There's a beautiful sandy beach along by Acre. And under cover of nightfall, they put up a huge leather screen in front of the walls to kind of stop artillery fire. They managed to cover this strewn rubble with sandbags to provide a level way for the men to get in. Extraordinarily sophisticated, organized piece of, thinking, really. And so the following morning, they're poised just before dawn to make a final attack. Final attacks in Islamic warfare are preceded by a huge thunder of noise, banging of drums to inspire the men to fight. Beforehand, they would go round and they would promise rewards, great rewards for the first people to make it onto the walls and so on. And so they'd psych the men up, really, for a massive attack on which many men were going to die. They would probably send their most disposable troops first. These disposable troops would probably be captured Christians from the local villages who were promised, freedom of serfdom and tax-free living if they survived. But they are the cannon fodder. You send them up first, let them be killed, and you keep your crack troops, your crack Mamluk troops till later on, when the enemy are quite worn down. And you advance along a broad front to try and keep the troops dispersed. But there were one or two points that they were really targeting. A couple of gates. One was where the accursed tower was, and one was a gate a bit further down, belonging to the Knights of St. John. And so this mass dawn attack. The Christians had gone into the church. The Archbishop of Acre had called on the people to die for the faith, and he was there almost in the front line, urging them on. So you see this visceral, trans-religious impact of people calling out the names of their gods, their saints, calling on the prophet, a wall of noise, and then the final assault. It goes fairly well for a while, but they get ground down, and the master of the Templars, who's an old man by the spirit of the times, he's in his 50s, and he's fighting in the front line. He's badly wounded, Guillaume de Beaujeu, and he says, I'm badly wounded. They couldn't really see. And people would say, well, if you go, the defense will collapse. But he said, I can't fight on. And indeed he couldn't. He slumped in his saddle and collapsed, and he dies back in the Templar castle a few hours later. But this undermines morale. They start to pour into the city. There's a defense from street fighting from the rooftops, the people hurling stuff down on them. But again, the Islamic troops are very well disciplined. They have locked shields. They advance like a kind of Roman phalanx, and probably with their shields over their heads. And street by street, they clear the city. And at a certain point, it collapses, and people run to the harbour, or they're massacred, or they're holed up and surrounded and killed, and the whole thing breaks down. There are a few ships in the harbour, not many. There's a man, rather unscrupulous Catalan, called Roger de Flor, who manages to get control of a Templar galley, and the rich women of the city run to the harbour with their portable, jewels and things in their hand, and he only takes on board those who can pay, and he becomes rich apparently within the space of a few hours. Others are left to
It's an ill wind that blows nobody good.
Yeah, the great Archbishop is taken out into a boat, but unfortunately falls into the water and drowns. And the master of the Hospitallers is wounded, and he's taken off. So is a man known as the Templar of Tyre, who's the main source for this, who was an Arabic-speaking Templar and who'd done various secret missions for the Templars. Now, he obviously survived and must have been taken off. A lot of other people run to the Templar castle, which is on the seashore and very strongly fortified. There are about 10,000 people hole up in this place, and they hole out for about 10 days, surrounded, while everybody else is either enslaved or raped or killed. Accounts are, fairly horrible as far as there are accounts. Unfortunately, the sources are not that good because the survival rate was not high. They hole up in this castle. There's a certain amount of negotiating about, okay, we'll let you go. We will organize we will agree to let you go, and we will organize a surrender. And a certain number of Muslim Mamluks come into the castle, but then they start grabbing the women and children, and then the knights kill them and throw them out and barricade it. And at that point, it's going to be no court is going to be given, and they undermine it, and it's undermined. And then, according to the sources, which may or may not be accurate, but there's an extraordinary finale of this that they're so eager to get inside and grab the stuff, which I think is that a large number of Muslims enter and start grabbing people and things. But a large part of the fortification, the structure of the building, have been undermined, and there's a massive collapse of building material, which kills a huge number of Muslims as well as a large number of Christians. And this is kind of like the symbolic last moment of a crusading presence in the Holy Land.
So 200 years of Crusader presence comes to an end with the fall of Acre. Do you think they could have held it? Do you think if they'd been, because I think there's, in the blame game that comes afterwards, there's a lot of talk that the Hospitallers weren't talking to the Templars, weren't talking to the German knights. And there's a sense that the siege could have been handled better from the Christian side. But do you think there was a possibility that they might have held out?
There obviously was a lot of disunity between the religious orders, and they certainly came in for criticism, which would lead to the end of the Templars. I don't think they could have survived, actually. When you start to think about it, long-range logistical support for any foothold in a Crusader kingdom is 1,000 miles away or something, not quite that far, but, from Italy. And it requires a continuous transfusion of people, material to shore it up. And once a Muslim sultanate establishes itself, which manages, at least for a time, to unify its people in a cause, it's game over. There could be no coming back. Obviously, there was a lot of blame attached to, the people who were there, but it really was a one-way ticket, I think, by the time the Mamluks got their act together. The only thing that could have saved it, possibly, were the Mongols, actually. If the Mongols had come back, and they did come back, but ineffectively, there were quite attempts to establish alliances with the Mongols. But I think, it's like trying to do, a treaty with a tiger, really, because I think if the Mongols had taken out the Muslims, they then would have taken out the Christians also. So, it's unviable to, the extraordinary 200-year adventure in the Holy Land was bound to come to an end. And obviously Crusader projects went on being hatched even in, up into the 16th century by the Portuguese. But
quite ironically, by that time, the Mamelukes have become enfeebled and they're no match for the Portuguese, although they don't confront each other directly.
They're no match for the Portuguese. And then, of course, they're no match for the Ottomans, who finally killed the last Mamluk Sultan in 1517. So it was 300 years of rule.
I read a book, I can't remember the author now, but he looks a bit like, the life and times of Colonel Blimp is, on the dust jacket. It's got that feel to it. But his theory is that empires last about 300 years, and this is a law of history. And I think he has to do some cheating, to show why the Roman Empire really only lasts 300 years, because you count it from this point and you end it in that point. And then, there's a new empire, which is this one, and that only lasts 300 years. But I wonder if that rings any bells with you.
Well, it's an interesting one, actually. I mean, how long did the Roman Empire last?
Well, it really depends, because when do you start it? Is it from when they get their first province in Sicily, and then do you end it maybe with the collapse of in the 235s, from then on, or do you say, do you say, well, this is actually a new empire from there, and then how contiguous do you say the Eastern Roman Empire is, and so on and so forth. So I think you have to do a fair bit of finagling, certainly where the Romans are concerned, because they go on for so long.
I think you could say that the Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years, really. Right. If you take 1453.
Well, when do they become effectively powerless, though, would be the question. Well, when is their force spent?
Well, probably actually sometime from they're enfeebled, I would say, from the end of the 18th century, really.
So that's basically 1800. So if you go back 300 years, that's 1500. Yeah, well, no, so it's longer than 300 years, even on that.
And the sick man of Europe, kind of staggers on, bits being stripped off during the 19th century, the Russian provinces and the Balkans, and, bits being chipped away. But you could say the last sultan didn't leave the palace until, 1921. But yes, the enfeeblement, really. I mean, the high watermark, probably, at which it's downhill, is probably the Siege of Vienna in 1689. It's sort of downhill from there in terms of military capability. But, conventionally they would say that this was a 600-year empire. So,
yes, it is interesting, this sort of contingent nature of history, where if the Khan of the Mongols hadn't died, it's hard to believe that Egypt wouldn't have been conquered by the Mongols. In fact, it's impossible not to think that.
It's impossible. It definitely would have been. And then what? I mean, I think the Mongols, like all these people, actually end up settling down, and they would probably maybe they would have been Islamicized, really. The other thing is that they would certainly be operating at and beyond their ecological limit by the time they got to Egypt. And of course, the sort of heartlands of the Islamic faith are in the Arabian Peninsula. So I suspect the Mongols would probably have become an Islamic empire.
So they would become the Mamluks then that hardly were.
Yeah, probably, quite probably. But what would have been the overall damage to Islamic culture in that case, really? Would they have destroyed a vast amount of the religious monuments and, the great mosques, the schools of Quranic teaching, would they have leveled the ground in quite a big way before they saw the error of their ways? Maybe Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, would have had an extra transfusion of longevity and vitality as a result of diaspora of people, trying to escape this red peril, if we can call it that, or whatever color peril you want to call it. Green peril. No, not green. That's Islamic.
Let's not go there, because before you know it, you'll say the wrong thing. Well, I mean, the trouble with counterfactual history is that it doesn't take long before it just becomes incredibly unprofitable. But it is interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm sure I saw somebody say somewhere that all history is counterfactual, because you have to understand what choices people were making at the time. And that if you don't allow for counterfactuals, you're almost denying them their free will, if you like. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not.
Yeah, I mean, the Crusades is a very weird thing, really.
It is extraordinarily weird, and ultimately somewhere that sort of led nowhere.
Yes, I mean, there was cultural transfusion. Outside Acre, I was sent by the archaeologists in Acre to go and look at the Hospitallers' sugar factory, which I couldn't actually find, but sugar, paper making, all kinds of technologies pass through into Europe that we don't really. Glass making. Acre was actually a great center of glass making in ancient times because the sand on the beach there is very, very fine. And, more stuff traveled across than, I think actually the trade connections are perhaps one of the more interesting parts of the crusading thing. And, the transfusion of stuff into Europe. I mean, the Venetians ended up, they started by buying sugar, buying paper, buying glass. Then they stole the technology and started large sugar plantations in Cyprus, glass making in Venice to the point where they were, selling fridges to Eskimos. Effectively, they were selling mosque lamps back to Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo. So there is a good case to be made for not the Crusades per se, but that the interactions resulting of it for a hemorrhaging of the industrial, commercial, and economic life of the Middle East into the West via the accidental side effects of these military encounters. That effectively Europe stole a lot of technology from the Middle East, which may well have come from further from the East to begin with, imported into Europe and really enrich Europe at the expense of, to the point where, they could outperform sort of silk weavers or glass makers or, all sorts of other technologies which the Islamic Middle East was very skilled at. And, I think that's extremely interesting.
Okay, well, that seems like a good place to end it. Slightly more optimistic note than perhaps the grisly end of Acre. So, Roger, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Russell. It's always great fun to talk to you.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, then I have a big favor to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests and, I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible because I think, they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.